go ahead and get started. Only 2 more lectures left in this course. I'm sure you're really excited about that. Chapter 28 deals with ecology. Whoops, there we go. And the ecology of communities. Okay, so last time we talked about populations, and we've discussed a zillion times this semester and last semester that a population is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area at the same time. Well, a community, in terms of ecology, takes a population to the next level. And the community is going to be all populations of all species in a specific area at the same time. Okay, so instead of just looking at a population of prairie dogs, the community would be the prairie dogs and the buffalo grass and the mosquitoes and the house flies and the coyotes and all of those other populations of all of the other species in that particular area. Okay, so interactions between the species in a community can be classified into 4 major categories. And we talked about interactions a little bit during the animal behavior lecture. But here's the 4 main types of interactions, and these boxes are really small, so just be aware of that as you're trying to write these in. But the first one is interspecific, S-P-E-C-I-F-I-C, competition. Okay, and that's going to be between species A and species B. Okay, so interspecific is between 2 different species. And then intraspecific would be the individuals competing within the same species. Okay, so the first one, interspecific, where A and B are competing, they both get harmed, right? Say the coyotes and the hawks are both competing for the prairie dogs for a meal, the coyotes and the hawks are both going to be harmed because they're not going to get as much food as they normally would if they're competing for that resource. The second type of interaction is the consumer prey relationship, where species A is the consumer and species B is the prey. So obviously, if this one is consuming the prey, they're benefited, and obviously species B is going to be harmed because they're being consumed. Then the third type of interaction among individuals in a community is going to be mutualism. Mutualism, and it's going to be between both species A and B again. And mutualism is when they both benefit. Okay, so if they're both harmed, it's competition. If it's mutualism, they're both going to benefit. They're going to help each other out. And we'll go through some examples of that a little bit later. And then the fourth way is commensalism. And that's again going to be between A and B. And that's where one benefits and the other has no effect. And I know several of you guys are in micro right now, and I've said that, man, you got to really look hard to find true commensal relationships, because in my opinion, if you look close enough, at some point, both of these are going to be benefited. Species B probably has some sort of effect where it's going to be benefited, but they may be hard to discover. Okay, so looking at the first type of interaction, the interspecific, is where two or more species use the same resources, same food supply, same water, same space, okay? And their interaction is going to be harmful to all species involved. Okay, so you could also say, okay, if the prairie dogs were the only food source, you have the hawks, the coyotes, the bobcats, okay? There may be 4 or 5 species that are involved, or there may be only 2. It just really depends on that situation, okay? So the competitors are going to be harmed because they're going to have a reduction in the access to those resources, and also there may be aggression where they're fighting over a meal. And you guys will have a lab today that's a worksheet that you will work on that looks at several different species fighting over a meal. Okay, so there may be, they may not get fed because there's only a limited amount of food, but then they also may be injured and harmed that way because of aggression and physical fights over those resources. Consumer prey reaction or interactions include not only predation. Okay, and typically when we think of predators and prey, we think of, you know, the coyote and the prairie dog, or the mountain lion and the deer. But predation in the strictest sense in terms of ecology could be a cow eating grass as well. So we typically don't think of a cow as a predator, but that would be the consumer, and the prey item would be the grass. So kind of in the most basic sense there. But consumer prey interactions also include parasitism. Okay, where we have parasites or individuals that harm others to benefit themselves, like parasitic worms, fleas, ticks, those types of things. Third one, mutualism, is where two species interact in a way that benefits both species, and this could make the species really thrive, both of them thrive, where neither one of them perhaps could survive on their own. And we'll talk about some of these as we go on, but ruminant animals like the deer or the cow, they really rely on microbes in that rumen, fungi, protists, and lots of bacteria to basically metabolize and break down the forages that they eat, the grasses and things like that. And so without them, without that interaction together, the cow would have or the deer, whatever, would have a hard time really being able to obtain nutrients. And then as a result, the cow is consuming the nutrients that feed those microbes, and the microbes release the energy that the cow needs. So it's a very important mutualistic relationship that maybe neither one of them would survive without each other. Okay, and then the fourth one is commensalism. That's where one is benefited and the other species is unaffected. And this is really interesting. There's been some new information come out about this. We used to say that mutualism, an example of that was the cattle egrets and livestock in savanna type ecosystems. Okay, cattle egrets are birds, and let me just see if I can't pull up a Google image here. Okay, images. So here they are. They hang out on cattle's back. These would be like in Africa and other places of the world, like this one. And they used to think that the birds would eat fleas and external ectoparasites from the cattle's back, but really they realized that they don't. They just kind of hitch a ride, and so they're not really helping the mammal out at all. They're just kind of hitching a ride and walking around with them, and what they're actually eating is bugs that fly up from when the cow steps. So they're saying now that that is a commensal relationship because the cow's not really benefiting. But I bet if you look hard enough, there's probably a way that the cow does benefit some way. We just don't know what it is. Interactions. Okay, so some interactions are permanent, right? Like we talked about the microbes in the ruminant animal. Okay, and that's going to be an example of symbiosis. Okay, where they have a prolonged, permanent, very close relationship with each other. Not all relationships are that way. Okay, there may be some that are kind of intermittent where they come and go, and maybe only in a relationship or interact together at certain periods of time. But those that are sustained relationships, that's an example of symbiosis. And the two participating species are called symbioents. And so we talked about the ruminant microbes. You could also talk about the human gut microbes, okay, the bacteria and so forth that live in our gut. And you could also look at lichens. You guys remember lichens? They are a fungus plus a photosynthetic symbiote. So like bacteria or a protist. Okay, that is a symbiotic relationship. We also, with fungi, talked about mycorrhizae, which is a fungal and plant root relationship. Okay, and a lot of times these relationships or these interactions involve co-evolution. And back in our evolution chapter, we talked about how pollinators and angiosperms, the flowering plants, have co-evolved together because they are so closely intertwined and so closely interacting that if there are changes in natural selection that cause specific changes in one species, then the other one typically follows suit, and that's called co-evolution. Okay, so within a community, competition over many different things is going to definitely determine where and what and how and what roles different species are going to have within that community. And so in each community, each species is going to have their unique ecological niche, or some people pronounce it niche. And that is basically where those animals live and kind of what role they play, or those species, I should say. So a species niche includes its habitat. Okay. Environmental factors for survival and reproduction. So the foods, the space, the shelter, water, things like that. The nutrients, and the methods by which it obtains those nutrients. Okay, so hunting methods, or nitrogen absorption methods, or leafing methods to absorb light for photosynthesis, and so forth. So for animal species, a niche might include the food and the shelter that it needs. And for plants, it might be soil pH, the amount of sunlight, water, all those types of things. Basically, the niche, the ecological niche, is combining all the factors that basically determines how that species is going to survive in that ecosystem. Okay, and so ecological niches have been studied for a while. Russian microbiologist G.F. Gauss looked at some protists back in the 30s and discovered that coexisting species living in the same environment at the same time, cannot completely overlap their niche. They cannot be exactly the same for an extended period of time, because competition is going to basically drive either one to extinction or one to cause some changes through natural selection. So interspecific competition prevents two species from occupying I put the wrong thing here. The same niche at the same time. Okay, sorry about that. So what Gauss looked at with his studies are the protist paramecia. Okay, remember those little guys we looked at in lab that kind of swam around, the little speed demons there. He looked at Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. And he noticed that if you grew them separately, they both really survived and did very, very well. When you put them together, though, in the same culture environment, they did not coexist together. One, Aurelia, always outgrew and basically outcompeted Paramecium caudatum. And so if you look at them separately, living in separate environments, okay, they kind of, after about 10 days, reach their carrying capacity and survive just fine. They have similar growth rates here, okay? But if you put them together in the same flask, within a few days, Aurelia is going to outcompete caudatum, and their population basically gets wiped out because there's not enough resources for both of them. They occupy the same niche, they eat the same foods, they hunt the same way. They basically cannot survive with the limited resources. So he decided to repeat this experiment with a different species, comparing caudatum, which we saw here, okay, the red one that got eliminated, with Bursaria. Caudatum, he discovered, feeds on bacteria that kind of float around suspended in the culture medium, where Bursaria feeds on those that live, the bacteria that kind of settle down and live at the bottom. And so these two paramecia were able to basically live in the same environment. They could coexist together because they had different niches, because they fed in different places. And so their niche was slightly different. Okay. When they're exactly the same, they cannot coexist together. And one population will either be wiped out or caused to change a little bit. So this process is called resource partitioning. Where basically the resources are kind of divvied up a little bit between the species. And another ecologist, Robert MacArthur, looked at some birds called the North American warbler, looked at 5 different species of those and how they partitioned resources. And this is kind of a classic experiment here. He found that they all live, the 5 different species live in the same area of the forest. They live in the same types of trees, but within the tree, they hunt and nest and spend their time in different parts of those trees. And so they're each employing different hunting tactics. They nest at slightly different times of day and times of year. And they have evolved behaviors that basically overlap or reduce the overlap in their niche and kind of prevent a little bit of that competition. And you can see this one here hunts and nests lower, this one kind of mid-tree, this one does the edges and so forth. Okay, so that was the interspecific competition. Okay, and we've talked again in the animal behavior unit about some aggression and things like that, the animals, territorialism and things like that, that they do to compete for resources and to kind of let one another know, hey, this is my mate, this is my space, this is my food, and so forth. But consumer prey reactions, or I keep saying reactions, interactions, again, are going to be predation and parasitism. And you guys have known what a predator is since preschool. But a predator is an organism that feeds on another organism. And predators include both carnivores and herbivores. Okay, remember we tend to think of the carnivores eating the herbivores, but the herbivores consume the plants as well. So there's that. And then microbes can also be predators and consume other microbes. Like here's the amoeba, the paramecium eats yeast, things like that. Okay, a parasite is going to live symbiotically with the prey, and the prey is called the host for all or almost all of the parasite's life cycle. Okay, so either the egg stage, the larval stage, or the adult stage, or all of them. And some prey or some parasites have multiple hosts. Parasites include like tapeworms that we looked at, fleas, ticks, all of those kinds of things. A lot of times they're going to be arthropods. So class Insecta or class Arthropoda, or I'm sorry, Arachnida. A lot of times are the parasites, but not exclusively, because we can have the helminths, Platyhelminthes, phylum Nematoda, and so forth. Parasites harm or weaken the host, but often do not immediately kill it. Now, there can be examples of where an animal or human could get a parasite like a worm infection or some sort of ectoparasite like fleas or lice or ticks or whatever. And the immune system is able to overcome that. But if there is a large enough parasite infection and maybe a lack of nutrition or a lack of clean water or some other factor, sometimes those parasites can weaken the host enough that a disease or malnutrition or something else will weaken it enough that it will be killed. Okay, so parasites don't want to always kill the host because they're going to lose their source of nutrients and could die themselves, but sometimes the host could get weakened so much that it does not make it. One way that organisms, that species can basically help protect themselves against predation, and we see this a lot in plants, is to produce toxic or bad tasting chemicals. And this is a defensive method to help the plants basically prevent being eaten, right? Because a plant's not going to get up and run, and it's not going to hide. It's kind of out there in the open at the mercy of the consumer. And so if they taste bad, less consumers will want to eat them. So plants have evolved defensive toxins that herbivores can basically taste and say, I don't want to eat this. However, coevolution has brought about many insects that have been increasingly effective at basically getting around those toxic substances and still being able to eat them. Like this guy here, it is a monarch caterpillar. It can store the plant's toxins, and then it is now toxic to predators. Okay, so milkweeds, a place where monarch caterpillars love to eat. That's their favorite food. They have toxins in them. There are certain milkweeds that if cattle or horses eat, it will cause a lot of damage and even death if they eat too many of the milkweeds. But the caterpillar, the larva here, is able to take those toxins and store it. And then if a bird comes along and eats it, the bird then consumes those toxins and either gets sick or decides, I'm never going to eat one of those caterpillars again. And your book had pointed out, I thought this was kind of interesting, that there's at least one type of insect that eats or consumes every single type of toxic plant. So I guess I didn't explain that too well. So for every toxic plant, there's at least one insect that eats it. Okay. Another way to help prey items and also, excuse me, both prey and predators is camouflage, and basically blending in with the background. And we have some examples here. The sand dab fish can blend in with different types of rocks there. Here's a horned lizard blending in with its surroundings to basically hide from predators. Predators can also hide as well. So here's a snow leopard hiding very well. This is a frogfish. It's hiding. It's supposed to look like a sponge. It's pretending it's a sponge, and then when prey comes by, it will snap out and grab it. So here's just some examples of organisms trying to blend in. This is a leaf sea dragon. It's trying to blend in and look like seaweed. Thorn tree hopper tries to blend in and look like those modified leaves there. These are succulents pretending they're rocks so things don't eat them. And then the viceroy caterpillar is trying to look like part of the plant material there. Now, have you ever noticed that bees and yellow jackets and bumblebees and some other insects are all yellow and black? Okay, we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But when you see something that's yellow and black, or if you're in South America and you find a brightly colored frog or toad, you'll know that those things are poisonous and they're dangerous. And so sometimes coloration can give away the fact that you need to stay away from this particular organism. And so these are called warning colorations. That basically warns predators to stay away. Okay, so we talked about the yellow and black colors. It will tell a predator like, hey, this thing's gonna sting me or bite me, or if it has a terrible chemical, like with a skunk, okay, that black with a white tail, that reminds you to say, hey, back off, don't get close here. Use some caution around these organisms. And so some prey can gain protection through mimicking other species. And so in mimicry, members of one species have evolved to look like members of another species. And then this mimic, the copycat, has gained advantages from this other species because they've already built in like, hey, we're yellow and black, we don't taste good. So this new species that evolved the yellow and black colorings, they're taking advantage of all of the education that the other species has provided with the predators. And so the yellow and black warnings colors for bees and bumblebees and yellow jackets and so forth is called Mullerian mimicry, and that's where two or more poisonous or bad tasting organisms share the same coloring pattern. So the viceroy butterfly and the monarch butterfly look very similar, and they're both really bad tasting. Okay, because they've stored those plant toxins from milkweeds or other plants, and so now they taste really bad. So if a bird comes by and it eats one of these, there's like, oh, I'm never eating that again. Next time it flies by and sees a monarch, it will mistake it for the viceroy. But the more of each of these that taste bad, the more predators decide or learn that those taste bad, the better it is for their populations that they're not getting picked off and eaten. Okay, so here we can do bees and yellow jackets as well. And don't let this confuse you. This is a moth. This is not a wasp. Okay, there's another type of mimicry called Bastian mimicry, and knowing the difference between the two is something that you'll need to know on the next test. But in Bastian, one harmless species is going to resemble a venomous or distasteful one. Okay, so if we go back here, they're all poisonous or distasteful. Okay, here one is, one isn't, and it's pretending it is. So this one, even though it looks very close to a wasp, a hornet, it is not venomous. And actually predators could actually eat it. And so you can see some of the differences here. This is called a proboscis. Basically its mouth part to feed off of nectar and other plant materials. It kind of like, it's like a straw. The antennae are very different as well. But look how they've evolved the abdomen and the coloration and so forth. The wings are a little bit different than these wings. But to a bird flying by that normally eats moths, it's going to see this as this and say, I'm going to avoid that because I've been stung by a wasp before and it really hurts and I don't want to get stung again, even though this guy has no ability whatsoever, can't sting. It's not toxic. It's not, the predator could actually eat that and not be harmed at all. But they don't know because they mimic or copy the venomous one. Okay, another type of camouflage, if you will, is called startle coloration. And that is where they have color patterns that look like eyes of larger animals. Okay, so if a predator gets really close, they can move their wings or whatever part of body this is on, and it looks like those eyes are moving, and the predator is coming over here like, ooh, that looks like something that could eat me. It's not a moth. I'm going to fly away or get away before that eats me, and it's basically just been tricked. And then another type of mimicry is called aggressive mimicry. And that's basically where a predator would lure in its prey. Okay, so here's an orchid mantis. So if you've ever seen a praying mantis, okay, this is an orchid mantis. Here's its leg. Here's a leg. Let me erase that here. There's one set pair of legs. There's a pair of legs. And then here, you can kind of see they have their legs that fold over, and they actually use those front ones to grab onto prey. Okay, so they look like a flower. And so an unsuspecting insect will come over and want to get some nectar from that flower, and it's actually flying right over to the mouth of the praying mantis or the orchid mantis. So those are examples of aggressive mimicry where they basically entice the prey to come in to be consumed. Next unit talks about mutualistic relationships. And remember, mutualistic relationships are beneficial to all of the participants. And an example of that is going to be the lichens. Okay, and we've talked about those before back when we talked about fungi. It's between a photo algae, which is a protist, or photosynthetic bacteria, and the fungi. And here's the lichen here. And basically the photosynthetic organism, whether it's bacteria or algae, will produce sugars from photosynthesis, and those sugars will nourish both the algae and the fungi. And the fungi kind of give the algae a nice little place, a secure place to live. The algae feed the fungi, or algae feed the fungi, and they have a nice, happy little relationship there. Okay, the other relationship that we have kind of talked about in terms of mutualism is associations with microbes. That inhabit digestive systems. Pretty much all mammals have microbes that live in the digestive system. Even termites do. They have a symbiotic relationship with protozoa to help them digest the wood that they eat. Fungi have symbiotic relationships with plant roots called mycorrhizae. In which the fungi help the plant roots absorb more water. The plant roots feed the fungi sugar, and they get along great together. Okay. Now, in some communities, some species have a more important role or a more influential role than some of the others, and those are called keystone species. And the keystone species role is out of let's see. proportion to its abundance in the community. So there may be only a few of these organisms, but they have a very, very important role. And so if they're removed from the community, the rest of the community will be significantly affected. And one example is the bush elephant in Africa. It's a keystone species. There's not a lot of them, but they do graze on trees and bushes and things like that to help keep the forests from moving out into the grassland communities. Another one is the cougar and or the mountain lion, and its relationship with organisms in mountain areas, like with deer and elk, and help maintain those populations. Last thing that we're going to cover is how communities change over time. This is called succession, and succession is a gradual change in a community and its non-living environment, which is basically the ecosystem. And so this is when a group of or groups of species gradually replace one another in a predictable sequence. And one thing that I used to do was this milk experiment, where you would set milk out on the counter and put some milk in the fridge, and some milk you would boil and basically sterilize, and you would set it out at like 8, 5, 3, and day 0. And you could actually smell differences. You would see differences in the different types of milk and the different bacterial species that went in succession from one another. And so I don't do that one anymore because it does kind of smell. But it's interesting to see that it goes from one type of bacterial species to the next once it has basically taken all of its resources, then another bacterial species will begin to thrive and so forth. And so it's like a predictable sequence. Okay, so there are these changes that take place, and the first species that begins are called the pioneer species. And these are going to be the invaders that come in, that they're pretty hardy. They don't have aversions to specific environmental factors and so forth. And so they can come in and establish, but they're going to eventually be displaced by other organisms or other species. And this pattern will continue until you get to a fairly stable climax community. And there's two forms of succession. There's primary and secondary succession. So primary succession is basically when the community starts where there's nothing left at all. There is no life left at all. And one way that I like to describe the difference between primary and secondary succession is, if in this situation, in primary succession, there's no soil left over. Okay, it's completely been eroded down to the rock. Okay, so a disturbance that could cause a need for primary succession might be like a glacier scraping the landscape and then melting and exposing the bare rock, or a volcano erupting and producing a new island. You know, there's no soil there initially, and so that has to build up, and then you'll get the pioneers coming in and so forth. And this process usually takes thousands of years. Okay, so here's a little fern coming up in the lava flow. Okay, so you have bare rock. You might have some lichens and mosses, and then you start, as those things die off, they contribute to the soil buildup. Then you get some smaller plants, smaller shrubs, and then eventually you'll get to the climax species, whatever it happens to be. But this is going to take thousands of years. With secondary succession, a new community will develop after an existing ecosystem is disturbed in a way that it leaves significant remnants of community members behind, may leave some seeds behind, the soil will be behind, those types of things. So forest fires, you know, that might be something that goes through. There's still going to be remnants of trees that have burned. There are going to be seeds there and so forth. And so some of the plants will be able to withstand the fire. And one other interesting thing is sometimes some seeds actually have to be burned and go through a fire before they will germinate. And so fire promotes regeneration of forests and grassland communities as well. But here's an example of secondary succession where you have a plowed field here. And if you were just to leave it go, you'll start out with some weeds, and then you may start to get some grasses, and then eventually, if you have enough moisture, you may get a forest there that grows in. And you can see succession in aquatic environments as well. But some of the characteristics that make up a climax community is going to be like what temperature this environment or this ecosystem is in, how much rainfall they get, what elevation they live at, the latitude in relationship to the equator, the type of rock that's there, if it's primary succession, and its exposure to the sun and the wind, which can be very damaging. Okay, so that finishes up chapter 28.